I don't think they can hear you. I think they don't know you're talking. We have someone speaking. Did you see him?
We've all heard or read in the paper about the changes the DOT are proposing to make to the intersection out here. They're on a fishing trip at the moment, but something eventually is going to happen. And the worst proposal they've come up with, or option so far, is lopping off the Baptist Common and moving the soldiers' monument someplace. Destination unknown. About everybody I've talked to is against this move. He's been there since 1892, should remain there. I have a petition here, I have several signatures, but after the meeting, if you want to look at it and sign it or not sign it, it's up to you. But it's just asking the state of New Hampshire to take that option off the books. Leave the monument in the Baptist Common. I'll be here with the petition. Thank you very much for your time.
Welcome. My name is Sue Conklin, and I am standing in for Steve Ullman, which is because the Antrim Historical Society is a member of the New Hampshire Historical Society, and we are grateful for today's program being presented by Mary Morris. It's the industrialization of the Granite State. As you may know or may not know, the Goodall Company and the Abbott Companies at one point in time had over 200 employees. So there was somewhere around 15 mills on Great Brook. And two other points of interest. July 4th, don't forget, there'll be the reading of the Declaration of Independence. And 51. On August 20th, Ted McGorry will speak about his Aunt Mary McGorry, who was a famous journalist, and we'll be talking about her in relationship to her love of Antrim. She is buried in our cemetery. So, Mary, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for having us today. My name is Mary. Like she said, I was born and raised right here in New Hampshire. I was born in Newport and was raised in Leominster, and now I live in Concord. So today I'd like to talk to you guys about the Industrial Revolution in New Hampshire. And in preparing for this, I read a lot about Antrim's town history. It was so fascinating. There was a lot of really neat things to learn, and all about the mills that were along Great Brook and is it Greig Lake. Absolutely fascinating history. So I thank you so much for inviting me to come to your town and to learn more about the history. So the Industrial Revolution in New Hampshire. The Industrial Revolution is basically just a time in history that was characterized by taking the work of humans and animals and transferring it to working on large machinery, usually by some other type of power like water power. And the Industrial Revolution is not just that work, but all of the financial and the social and the economic changes that came along with the change of that system. So the Industrial Revolution, it started in England in the 1750s, and it was right around that time that Antrim was formed, and in 1748, 1746, I believe, right around that time. And in England, it was a time where the industry changed from a cottage industry over to the mills. And by the time the 1780s rolled around, there were about, they had hundreds and hundreds of factories spread all over England, and the textile industry was starting to slow down. This is a picture of one of the mills in Manchester, England. You can see what it looked like. There were, at times, hundreds and hundreds of looms in the textile mills. And we'll learn a little bit more about the Amoskeag factories and the number of mills that they had or the looms that they had in their mill as well. Next. Now, New Hampshire, before the Industrial Revolution, Antrim was a very typical town in the sense that there were cottage industries set up. Almost all of people's materials for those cottage industries were locally sourced. And you had to barter within your town. If you wanted to take your goods out, you had to do it by river. There really actually weren't that many roads to do so. It wasn't the easiest way to get things from one place to another. So what the cottage industry looked like was there would be an agent who would make sure that he would set up contracts with people working in their own homes. And for instance, you would have a cordwainer, somebody who would make the shoes, but there would be somebody that would cut out the stamp of the shoe from leather. That after they did about a week's work, all of that material would be sent to the next person, who would then form that shoe or the leather into a sole. It would then go to another person, and eventually the agent, through these series of steps, would have set up the entire production of the shoe from start to finish. A woman could make fabric in her home, but she was using primarily locally sourced materials that were brought to her by an agent. And this was a way that people could work in their own homes. They set their own hours. They were responsible for their own time, and it was really a great source of income. If it didn't actually pay cash, a lot of times it paid in bartering. This man here on the upper left, he's a cordwainer. He makes the shoes, and again, that actually was a job that would have been done in somebody's shed off to the side of their house. The loom, almost every town had at least one person with a loom, but many people in town actually had them as towns got larger. This shows all of the tools that a woman would have used from start to finish, except for one. The spinning wheel is not there. But we have some of these items in the back as well that you guys can look at later. These are called shuttles. And we have a small shuttle in the back that was used on a loom like this. They would have to card the wool, they would have to spin the wool, and then they would have to turn it into skeins and then use those skeins to weave the fabric. This man here is in the cottage industry of making paper. His horse is used to grind up the wood. And two things that are used for that wood, or that wood pulp is used for, before the wood pulp is taken away, it's soaked down with water, it's ground up, and then it releases tannic acid, which was also used for tanning hides. So those were two things that were important in the paper making industry before we began having mills. And again, recognize that almost all of this work is being done by human power or animal power. So the raw materials that were plentiful in New Hampshire were things like animal hides, animal hair, and wood. And those are things that you would have gotten right here in your own town, or they would have been sent from, when I was reading about Antrim specifically, sent from Hillsborough by small boat on the river, or taken the long way around by road at that point. So most everything, though, they tried to locally source it because it was the least expensive way of getting the material to the town, is to have it right there. So, for instance, the cow provides the leather for shoes, the wood provides the logs for houses, and the sheep provides the wool for things like mittens and hats, etc., and large skeins of fabric that were made to then create types of clothes. So before the Industrial Revolution, we had lots of types of mills in New Hampshire, and those were sawmills and grist mills. You can click to the next, and I'll just bring up another. So a sawmill here on the left, a grist mill on the right. And when I was doing some reading about Antrim, it looked like the first sawmill was 1775, and first grist mill was 1777. So that's about 30 years that people were having to transport their grain and their corn to a mill that was about 9 miles away. So if you think about that amount of time, and there's stories of people taking it in their boats on the river, and the boats capsizing between here and Hillsborough, and people losing their grain, their only source of income, and their only source of food for their family for the winter. So it was quite an experience for people here in Antrim to get their grain out before there was a grist mill built here. Now, does anybody know specifically what this is? This sign right here? So this is called the King's Broad Arrow, And this was the arrow that was marked on the white pine trees that had to be a certain circumference. But before we became our own country, the United States of America, the king would send agents through, and New Hampshire was well known for having the tall white pine trees with the spectacular girth, and they were just fantastic, and the king wanted them for the masts on his ships. And so he would mark those trees with this arrow. If you bought a property or if you bought a plot of land and it had trees on there with that arrow, you could not chop them down. So even if you wanted your cabin right there, you couldn't put your cabin there unless the agent came to chop down the tree. So it was actually, you could receive a very high fine, even be jailed for chopping down one of those trees. So this is a very typical sawmill in early New Hampshire. You can see it's powered by water. A grist mill also powered by water. Mills were almost always along moving water. So, now this man, Samuel Slater, he lived in England. He worked almost his entire early life. He worked in the mills in England. He by the late 1700s, 1789. He actually, he felt like the textile industry was kind of dying down in England, and he wanted an opportunity to make more money. He was an entrepreneur, and he bypassed this law that England had that you could not carry any of these plans for the mills. You couldn't carry them out of the country. And so what he did, he had it's not documented as such, but he had what we might call today a photographic memory. He actually memorized all the plans for the way a mill operated and all the looms and how it all came together. He memorized all those plans. He set sail for America, and he landed in Rhode Island, and he built his first mill, the Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So he actually came up with, his very first mill was just a mill, but about 20 years later, he built a second mill that utilized what became known as the Rhode Island system, and that was where it was a mill town with tenement housing, with a mill store, everything that mill workers could possibly need right there in that area where they worked. And so Samuel Slater was definitely the father of the Industrial Revolution right here in America, and almost all of the mills that began coming up to New Hampshire, almost all of the mills utilized that Rhode Island system that he made famous. Here's the main form. This is actually one of his early diagrams of the water wheel that was used in the mills. And the first mills were textile mills. Actually, the very first mill that he built in 1778 was a spinning mill. And then 20 years later, what he built was an actual textile mill, a cotton mill. And this meant in New Hampshire that we began changing from what was a cottage industry where an agent set up different forms of work for different people, but you got to determine your own hours and you got to determine really how much you wanted to get paid for something. It changed from that to a system where people went to work. They stopped working in their own home, and of course this meant you didn't get to set your hours and you were held to the same pay as what everybody else was getting paid. And there wasn't a lot of chance for that to change or for any growth in that, especially if you were a woman working in the mill. Here's a picture of a textile mill in Manchester. This is the Amoskeag Mills. This is one of their sample books. I even remember sample books from the 1970s. So the sample books that were set up where they would get sent to different towns, and the store would have all these samples. You could pick your print and what you wanted. And here's a diagram of where all the textile mills, the largest textile mills in New Hampshire, were located. You can see again, all of them were along bodies of water. Almost all of them were moving bodies of water and not a lake. The Amoskeag Mill, this picture is from the 1880s, and the Amoskeag Mill at that point had become the largest mill in the world. It employed 7,500 people. There were 24,000 looms in the mill at this point. So if you can imagine how large that was, if anybody's been down to the Lowell Mills, which is a National Park Service site, it can give you an idea of exactly how loud, how deafening it was to work in one of the mills. Now, every successful factory system needs, and I think you'll recognize maybe from your knowledge of Antrim, that Antrim provided these things to their factory workers as well. Maybe not on such a large scale, but it did. So here we actually have the Sawyer Woolen Mills, which are in Dover, New Hampshire, and this is the site of the first women's strike in the history of the world. Happened at the Chico Mills in Sawyer. 400 women went on strike. Their mill had been purchased by a new owner, and he decided to not keep up the same rate of pay that they had been receiving. He gave them a 25-cent per hour decrease in pay. 400 women went on strike, and they striked for about 3 months until the owner started employing new people. The strike was not successful, and the women went back to work so as not to lose their jobs. But the Sawyer Woolen Mills, this is a good description of what a mill system would have looked like. And again, this is an example of what was the Rhode Island system. This is the central mill. You can, sorry, there's 4 things. So the first thing is the river, actually, that's needed. It's always a moving river. It keeps the gears working in the factory, and it allows things to work like the looms, specifically in a textile mill. The second is the building that houses the actual looms or the actual machinery. The third is the tenement housing. That's very, very important because as the mills got larger, they started advertising overseas, and they said, even, we'll pay your way to America if you contract to work with us for a certain amount of time. So they had to have a place for people to live while that was happening. One of these houses, it had approximately 6 to 8 bedrooms usually, and each bedroom was inhabited by one family. So there were about 5 or 6 families living in one house. And they all shared that one little privy out behind the back, if you can see the next one. And lastly, they had to have a train or some type of system to bring the product in and out. In this case, in the Sawyer Woolen Mills, it was bringing cotton in from the south and bringing it up to New Hampshire, and then when the product was finished, it was taking it back out. The employees, though, even though all these other things are important, the employees were the most important part of the factory. You can see, like I touched on a little bit, many immigrants came to New Hampshire to take advantage of this, of the pay. Children were allowed to work in the mill. As long as you were 5 years old or older, you could work in the mill. So this was a huge opportunity for families when you were living in Ireland and your family was starving and your father came home with tickets and said, I got us a contract. We're going to go. We're going to dig ourselves out of this. We're going to, you know, America's the land of opportunity. We're going to have this amazing opportunity. So we're going to do this together. And so if you were 5 years old or older, you could work in the mill with your family. This is a picture here of, these are Rochester mill workers. And these are employees that were at the Amoskeag Mill in Manchester as well. And you can see that there's some fairly young children working. Here's one. But also the men were employed there as well. Men were usually the supervisors or the foremen, and women did the labor. These 2 pictures were taken by a man named Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine was a man who was actually hired, eventually hired by companies or by organizations who were against child labor. And he went into the mills and took pictures of what it was like for these children to work in the mills. They were working, whole families were working anywhere from 10 to 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. Of course, they had Sunday off so that they could go to church. That was a very important part. A lot of times when you signed that contract saying, yes, I'll work for you, you also, part of the contract included you had to go to church. It was a church of your choice, but you didn't have to, they didn't want people who didn't have a strong value system as well. So that was approximately 10 to 13 hours a day, just depending on the factory. Again, if you were over 5 years old. This picture here on the right, this little girl is working on the loom. Small children were usually hired to work on the looms because their hands were so small. You didn't have to disassemble the loom to fix a thread that had maybe snapped or to fix a part that had come apart. So a small child was able to reach their hand in and fix that without disassembling the machine. Sometimes without even stopping the machine. A lot of children lost fingers, hands, and were even killed by things like the shuttles, which went 30 miles an hour. That original little shuttle I showed you on the loom is now a large shuttle. It has very pointed ends. It goes back and forth at 30 miles an hour, and sometimes if a child's in the way, it knocks them out. So this was one of those things about working in the mills that people just knew it really wasn't a safe environment, but again, it was a good opportunity for your family. A lot of times the windows were nailed shut because the humidity in the room had to stay high. If the humidity was not high, then the threads would actually break easier. So the threads were very fragile in the looms. And so for instance, they would nail the windows shut. Sometimes they would flood the floor with water, like a 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch of water, and heat the floor from underneath. So it would keep the room at a certain temperature or humidity level for those threads. The boys, they would climb on the looms. It was up to them to make sure that the loom never had to stop operation. When the shuttle ran out of thread, they would have a new shuttle ready to throw down, and when the old shuttle was out of thread. So the whole job for the children was to keep things up and working constantly. Now the children do look pretty happy, but or they do certainly on the left. But in 1910, it really became very obvious to people. We actually had 3 generations at that point of people who came to the New World. They began working in the mills. By the time they were 14 or 15, they didn't have anything else to do. A lot of them did not know how to read or write. All they could do was continue working in the mills, marry somebody who worked in the mills, have children. Their children grew up from 5 years old and on, began working in the mills. And so this happened for about 3 very short generations before we realized that, it's not benefiting anybody to be raising any generations who don't know how to read or write or figure math or anything like that. So it was at that point here in New Hampshire that we began making child labor illegal. It was because of the mills. Now factory life in New Hampshire, next actually, sorry. So here's a quote that was said by Thomas Young. He was a man who traveled through New England, and he actually documented all of these mills. And he said, "None of the manufacturing towns of New England please me so much as Manchester in New Hampshire. Unlike its great godmother, which would be Manchester, England, it has clean air, clear waters, and sunny skies. Almost every street is an avenue of noble trees." And Manchester was a town that was actually created as a mill town. It was a town that was created with the Rhode Island system. All of Manchester was a bunch of Rhode Island systems set up for the various mills. And that was, before that point, it was Dairyfield. It was a very tiny little village, and Manchester didn't even really grow out of that. It just grew up separately and encompassed Dairyfield after that. Now, it's important to remember that a lot of manufacturing companies, although we started with manufacturing or with using wool, and then we changed to cotton, it's important to remember that they made other things as well, especially when you consider that cotton is not grown in New Hampshire, and most of our cotton came from the South, and in the mid-1800s we had this massive war with the South, so of course they weren't going to continue sending us trainloads of cotton. So we had to think of other things to create in our mills. So here's 3 of them. This is the percussion cap rifle. We started manufacturing that in the 1850s, 1855, in Manchester at the Amoskeag Mills as well. But then it turned into the Amoskeag rifle at the start of the Civil War. And the Amoskeag rifle is the type of machinery that was credited for winning the war for the North because it was a brand new type of machinery. The South did not have rifles like we had from the North, and we were able to fire so much quicker with rapidity that we could not, that the South actually, when it all came down to it, they couldn't keep up with the amount of weaponry that we had. We also manufactured steam engines and steam fire engines and steam locomotives as well in Manchester. Now the shoe factory is also an industry that expanded in New Hampshire. Like you saw on the first slide how the man was making shoes right there in his home. we then moved that system to the factory as well. And this is actually a job that men and women both did equally. They were usually paid about the same and took about the same amount of labor. And before the Industrial Revolution, a shoe did not have a left or a right. It was called a straight shoe. And so when you went to go get your foot sized for a shoe, they would just size one of your feet and they would make a double shoe, but they were both straight shoes. The Industrial Revolution actually brought the concept of having a left and a right shoe. It was also the only time that they ever began making huge amounts of shoes without anybody that they had in mind to buy them. So shoes were made in the factory and they were sent out to stores, whereas previously all of the materials were put together and then they were specifically made for the person that wanted the shoe. Now we have all of these tools in the back for you guys to look at afterwards, but this is called a shoe last. This is a last for a straight shoe. This is before the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, we changed to having an iron shoe last. It was mounted upside down, so first the sole of the shoe was created, and then and then the boot was formed around it. This is a picture of an apprentice and his master pre-Industrial Revolution. The glassmaking industry was huge in New Hampshire as well. Stoddard was really the first home of the glassmaking industry in New Hampshire, but other places here, especially in what's considered the western part of New Hampshire, we had a high amount of a certain type of sand, and it produced amber glass, green glass, blue glass, but no clear glass at all. And so New Hampshire was very famous, especially for its green glass. Stoddard had this beautiful green glass, and people wanted it until milk started being sold in glass bottles, and people didn't want their milk to look green. They couldn't tell that it was fresh, and so they actually started switching things over to having clear glass, and at that point is when our glass industry began dying down. Now also keep in mind that in order for glass to be made, it has to have these blasting kilns, blasting at over 2,000 degrees. There were raging fires going all the time, which most of the factories burned down within a few years of being built. They would build another factory. It just was not an industry that, after people stopped wanting colored glass, it wasn't an industry that really was able to stay or maintain its popularity in New Hampshire. One way you can tell if a piece of glass is handmade or factory made would be the pontil point. And this stick here is called a pontil. And you would dip it in to the glass, or you would put the glass in the end, you would dip it into the fire, heat it up. You were able to blow through the pontil to create a bubble on the other end. But when you separate that glass off from the pontil point, you have to very carefully tap it with a hammer, and it breaks off and it leaves a little bump on the bottom of the glass. As opposed to stamped glass that was put into a mold where the glass was put in, heated up, and made into this bottle with stamps. And we have several bottles back here on the back table that you guys can look at, some that were handmade and some that were made by glass factories. Here we go, here's some stamped glass. This is actually a Stoddard bottle. I'm not sure if we still have that particular one with us, but it is, I think actually it's on display at the Historical Society. But here's some stamped glass. Again, even some stamped glass is actually pretty valuable now, especially if it was something that was made in one of the very early factories. And the logging industry, we can't talk about the Industrial Revolution without realizing how the logging industry changed things here in New Hampshire as well. Now the logging industry was done primarily in northern New Hampshire. It was a lot of Nordic families that came, the Swedes, the Finnish, and they came, and it was really a three-season job. You would actually go up to northern New Hampshire in the fall, you would set up your logging camp, and you would start to fell the trees. In the winter, you were able to bring those trees out by sledge. It was a lot easier than bringing them out when there was no snow on the ground. They would be piled beside the rivers, and in the spring, as the ice melted, they would then float those down the river to the sawmills. This actually is talking about the log drives on the Connecticut River, but we also use the Northern Merrimack, the Androscoggin, the Pemigewasset, all of those were used in the logging industry. So this man, there were actually several types of work. There were foremen, and there were the men that actually did the laboring. There were skidders, the men who brought out the logs on the skids. This is one tool that was used. It's called an auger. The auger was used to drill a hole in the log. The logs were then tied together, or not tied with ropes, but tied with, or fastened together with chains. So when they floated down the river, they all floated in the same direction. It prevented so many jams happening in the future. This man here, he's drilling the log, drilling the hole in the log. He's going to attach the chains, and he's using an auger, and then he's using this, he would use this part called the cant hook. And a man from New Hampshire, actually, Peavy, he discovered that he could put these two things together, the auger, which actually was, then he turned it into a pike. An auger or a pike and a cant hook, he could put them into one tool together, and it was called the Peavy. We have one on the back table. It doesn't have the long pole attached to it, but you can see the type of machinery that was used. So that Peavy was used or it was invented during the Industrial Revolution here in New Hampshire to be used in the logging industry. Granite quarrying, this was a job that men from every country that came to America, the men worked in quarrying. If you were strong enough, but especially the Swedes had quarrying back in Sweden, and they could get a much better pay here in New Hampshire for granite quarrying. So a lot of them came specifically to work in the quarries. Now this picture and the one on the next page, but don't go there yet, I'm sorry, are taken at the Granite Works in Concord, which is Swenson Granite Works or Rattlesnake Hill. That is the quarry that we took all of the granite from to make New Hampshire State House and to make the New Hampshire Historical Society. Also the granite from the Brooklyn Bridge was taken from Rattlesnake Hill in Concord as well. It also went to create the Library of Congress and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Washington, D.C. So New Hampshire is called the Granite State for a very good reason. Next. So this is also Rattlesnake Hill in Concord. And you can see here some of the tools that are used or were used for granite quarrying. We have an example of these in the back as well. These are called feathers and a wedge. And the feathers and wedges were used to create these very long, straight cuts in the rock, which seem impossible when you're thinking that you're not working with electric tools. But what they did was they used a star wedge, which I also have in the back, a star wedge to drill very, very little holes, or to tap little holes along the top of the rock. And then they would insert the feathers and the wedges, and they would do it all along the side. You can see each one of these lines is a line where a feather and wedge was driven down. And it was a series of fairly light taps all along the rock, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it just separated that rock from top to bottom. It was a pretty precise job, but you can imagine how much one of these blocks weighs, a tremendous amount. Now, the Industrial Revolution coming to New Hampshire, it meant